There is a grave in the New Mexico desert that 500,000 people have visited. It sits behind an iron cage, under a headstone that reads, Pals, and it might be completely empty. Billy the Kid, the most iconic outlaw in American history, was supposedly buried at Fort Sumner on July 15, 1881, but no verified photograph of his actual grave exists. Not because cameras didn't exist, not because no one thought to look, but because the earth itself conspired to erase the evidence. Floods scattered the bones, thieves stole the headstone more than once, and the spot everyone visits today, it was chosen not by archaeologists or forensic scientists, but by the fading memories of old men pointing at dirt. This is the story of how one of America's most famous graves became one of its greatest unsolved mysteries. And by the end, you'll understand why the single authenticated photograph of Billy the Kid, a tintype showing a young man very much alive, might be the only honest image we'll ever have of him. He is the most photographed grave in the Old West, and possibly the most fraudulent. Thousands arrive every year, leaving bullets and coins on the mounds. But here's the disturbing truth. There is no verified evidence that Billy the Kid is actually buried there. The entire mythology of the American West's most famous outlaw rests on a grave that might hold nothing but New Mexico clay. And the stakes couldn't be higher, because if the grave is wrong, then the legend we've built around it is a story we've been telling ourselves for 140 years, with nothing underneath to support it. By the end of this video, you'll understand why floods, theft, conspiracy, and a century and a half of neglect mean we may never know where Billy the Kid truly lies. And that single photograph that exists of the kid, it only deepens the mystery. But to understand how we lost a grave, you have to understand the man who filled it. Let me set the stage. If you're fascinated by the untold mysteries behind history's most legendary figures, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories they didn't teach you in school. Now, let me take you back to 1881 and the killing that started it all. The New Mexico Territory in the late 1870s was not the romantic west of dime novels. This was a place where the sky was too big and the law was too small. Rival factions, cattle barons, merchants, corrupt officials fought for economic control of Lincoln County, and the weapons they used were not lawyers and ledgers, but hired guns and ambushes. The Lincoln County War, as it came to be called, turned a remote stretch of the American frontier into a killing ground, and it created Billy the Kid. He was born Henry McCarty. He reinvented himself as William H. Bonney, and the newspapers and dime novel writers mythologized him as Billy the Kid, a name so unstable it practically predicted the chaos that would follow him into the grave. Even the basic facts of his life resist verification. He was left-handed, or so the legend goes. Even that detail is disputed, likely an artifact of the tintype photography process flipping the image. The name itself is a mask on top of a mask, a man with no fixed identity, foreshadowing the instability of his final resting place. Billy wasn't the mastermind of the Lincoln County War. He was a participant, a teenager swept up in a conflict between powerful men who used young guns as disposable instruments. But he killed, and he was marked for it. His conviction for the murder of Sheriff William Brady was the legal event that sealed his fate. He was sentenced to hang, and then he escaped. That escape, dramatic, violent, the stuff of instant legend, is worth remembering not just because it made him the most wanted man in the territory, but because it planted a seed that would grow for over a century, the idea that Billy the Kid could cheat death. That idea will matter later. Now enter Pat Garrett. Garrett had once been Billy's friend. They'd drunk together, played cards in the same saloons, moved through the same circles of frontier life. But Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County, and in the New Mexico Territory, friendship and duty rarely survived each other. Garrett was a tall, quiet man who understood the arithmetic of his position. Bringing in the kid meant fame. Failure meant irrelevance. He chose fame. By the spring of 1881, Garrett had already captured Billy once, at a place called Stinking Springs, after a freezing standoff that killed one of Billy's companions. Billy was taken alive, tried, convicted, and sentenced. The escape that followed only raised the stakes. Garrett had caught the kid and lost him. He would not make that mistake again. The landscape they moved through deserves its own sentence. Dust and alkaline flats stretching to every horizon. The Pecos River cutting a lazy, deceptive line through scrubland and cottonwood groves. Distant mountains capped with snow that would melt in spring and send water surging down valleys no one was watching. This was the stage. By the summer of 1881, Billy the Kid was the most wanted man in New Mexico, and Pat Garrett knew exactly where to find him. The question no one was asking, the question that would haunt historians for the next century and a half, was what would happen to the body. Fort Sumner Cemetery sits at the end of a road that bears the Outlaws' name, 3501 Billy the Kid Road, New Mexico. The cemetery itself is older than the legend. Fort Sumner had been a military post, established in the 1860s during the forced relocation of the Navajo people on the Long Walk. When the army left, the post was repurposed. Buildings became ranches, barracks became homes, and the cemetery became a patchwork of the territory's dead. Soldiers, settlers, Navajo who had perished during their internment. Graves marked with wooden crosses that rotted in the sun. No master map, no surveyor's grid, just holes in the ground and the memories of those who dug them. The geography tells you everything you need to know about what would come. The cemetery occupies low ground in the Pecos Valley, within reach of the river that gave the valley its life. Cottonwoods line the banks. Alfalfa fields stretch in every direction, green against the tawny desert. It looks peaceful, almost idyllic if you don't understand what rivers do to low ground. The Pecos floods. It has always flooded. Snowmelt from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains can send walls of water down the valley with little warning, and the river's course has shifted over the centuries in ways that make old maps unreliable. The river that gave life to the valley would eventually come for the dead. Visit the site today and you'll find 3 low mounds of packed earth under a shared headstone and a footstone. A fenced perimeter surrounds the plot. A posted map shows Billy the Kid points of interest in the area. A historical plaque stands nearby offering a sanitized version of the story. And the headstone, the artifact at the center of this entire mystery, bears an inscription that has become one of the most famous epitaphs in the American West. Powell's, Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Baudry, William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid, died July 18. But here's the first problem, and it's a problem that starts before the headstone was even carved. Billy was killed on July 14th. He was buried on July 15th. The stone says July 18th. Already, the stone is lying, and it will keep lying. The men buried beside the kid deserve their own moment in this story, because their presence in that shared grave is part of the mythology and part of the problem. Tom O'Folliard was Billy's closest riding partner. On December 19, 1880, during the pursuit that would end at Stinking Springs, Garrett's posse caught O'Folliard in the dark. He was shot off his horse. He didn't die quickly. According to witnesses, he looked up at Garrett and said, "Don't shoot any more. I'm killed." He was buried at Fort Sumner. Charlie Baudry died 4 days later at Stinking Springs during Billy's capture. Garrett's men shot him when he stepped outside at dawn. Whether they mistook him for Billy or simply didn't care has never been settled. Baudry staggered back inside, dying. Billy reportedly pushed him back toward the door, toward Garrett's men, saying, "He's dying. Give him his wish." Whether that exchange is true or apocryphal, it's woven into the legend now, and it connects to the larger theme of this story, how myth contaminates fact until you can't separate one from the other. Bowdre, too, was buried at Fort Sumner. 7 months later, when Billy joined them in the ground, the three were together, pals in life, pals in death. Now, you might think, 3 men, 1 grave, 1 headstone. Simple enough. But nothing about Billy the Kid's death has ever been simple. The original markers, if distinct wooden crosses ever stood over each individual grave, rotted or vanished within years. The stone headstone that visitors see today is not original, it's a replacement. And it is not the first replacement. The cemetery was never well maintained. Fort Sumner was a small, remote community where the living had enough trouble caring for themselves, let alone the dead. Wooden markers splintered, iron fittings rusted. The desert wind scoured inscriptions off sandstone. This was never a secure resting place. It was a hole in the desert near a temperamental river, marked by a stone that would be stolen, flooded, and argued over for the next 140 years. The Pecos, meanwhile, ran its cycles. High water in spring, low water in autumn, each flood season subtly reshaping the land around the cemetery in ways that were invisible year to year, but catastrophic over decades. The stage was set, a fragile grave in a flood-prone valley, in a territory that was already forgetting its dead. All it would take was time, and the Pecos River, the night of July 14th, 1881. Fort Sumner. The air was warm, the kind of dry summer heat that lingers after sundown in the high desert. Billy was visiting. Some accounts say he came for a woman, others say for food, a simple meal at a friend's house. Whatever drew him there, it brought him to the doorway of Pete Maxwell's bedroom. Pete Maxwell was a local rancher, one of the area's most prominent figures, and his home sat within the old fort compound. Garrett was already inside. He had come to Maxwell's room to question him about Billy's movements, and he sat on the edge of Maxwell's bed in near total darkness, speaking in low tones. Billy walked in. The room was dark enough that neither man could see the other clearly. Billy noticed a figure on the bed. He paused, and he asked a question that has echoed through 140 years of American mythology. ¿Quién es? ¿Quién es? Who is it? In Spanish, the language of the territory, the language of the border, the language of a man who lived between worlds. Garrett recognized the voice. He did not hesitate. He drew his pistol and fired twice. 2 shots. Silence. 1 bullet struck Billy in the chest, just above the heart. The kid fell beside Maxwell's bed. He was 21 years old, or so the legend says. Even his age is disputed. Pete Maxwell scrambled off the bed and out of the room. The smell of gun smoke filled the enclosed space, acrid and heavy. And then there was nothing but the sound of Garrett's breathing, and the knowledge that the most wanted man in New Mexico was dead on the floor. In a territory where men died loud, in gunfights on dusty streets, in ambushes in canyon passes, Billy the Kid died in a bedroom, in the dark, asking a question he'd never get answered. And here's where the story most people know ends. Billy the Kid was shot, and he was buried. Case closed, except the case was never closed, because the grave was never secure. Garrett had hunted this man for months. He had killed someone who had once been his friend. The moment should have felt like triumph. Instead, by later accounts, Garrett seemed unsettled, almost hollowed out. The killing would define and eventually corrode his reputation. Some called him a hero. Others called him a coward who shot an unarmed man in a dark room. The man who killed Billy the Kid would spend the rest of his life trying to profit from that single trigger pull, and it would never be enough. The next day, July 15, 1881, the community buried Billy in a hasty ceremony in the old military cemetery, beside his old riding partners O'Folliard and Bowdre. No photograph was taken of the burial, no death mask was made. In an era when post-mortem photography was common, when families regularly posed with their dead as a final keepsake, no one documented Billy the Kid's last image. Or if someone did, The photograph has been lost to time so completely that its existence cannot be confirmed. The date discrepancy on the headstone now takes on fuller weight. The stone reads, "Died July 18th. Billy was killed on the 14th, buried on the 15th. The stone is wrong by at least 3 days. Was it a carver's error, a deliberate alteration meant to confuse, or simply the indifference of a community that had already moved on to the next crisis? Whatever the reason, it established a pattern that would define this grave for the next century and a half. From the very first marker, the record of Billy the Kid's resting place was unreliable. There was no official burial record, no surveyor's mark, no map of the cemetery with the exact plot noted. The grave existed because people remembered where they'd dug the hole, and memory, in the desert, erodes faster than stone. But here's what no one accounted for. The Pecos River was less than a mile away, and it was patient. Within years of Billy's death, the mythology was outpacing the facts at a gallop. Dime novels rolled off Eastern presses. Newspaper editors embellished and invented. Garrett himself co-wrote a book with a journalist named Ash Upson, turning the killing into a narrative of frontier justice. But the grave, the physical, actual grave, was not a monument. It was a patch of dirt in a neglected cemetery, the original wooden marker, if one ever stood distinctly over Billy's plot, rotted or vanished. The shared headstone bearing the word "Pals" would not be placed until years later, and the exact date of its installation is itself a subject of debate among historians, who can't agree on the evidence because there isn't enough evidence to agree on. Fort Sumner was shrinking. The old military buildings crumbled or were repurposed into obscurity. The community around the cemetery was small, aging, and focused on survival, not preservation. The people who knew exactly where Billy lay were growing older, and they were not writing anything down. This is where the mystery begins, not with a conspiracy, not with a cover-up, but with something far more mundane and far more destructive: neglect. The grave was already vulnerable. The forces that would erase certainty, water, time, human greed, and the stubborn refusal to look, were already in motion. By the turn of the 20th century, Billy the Kid had been dead for nearly 2 decades. His legend was growing, his grave was disappearing. And then the river came. The Pecos River flood of the early 1900s was not a single dramatic event that makes for easy storytelling. It was a process, the accumulation of seasons, snowmelt from the Sangre de Cristos, storms that dumped water into a watershed already saturated. The river swelled, crested, and broke its banks, and the low-lying ground around Fort Sumner took the brunt. The old military cemetery was directly in the flood's path. What a flood does to a cemetery is not cinematic. It is quiet and total. Coffins, if coffins were used, and for many frontier burials they were not, are buoyant. Wooden boxes rise in saturated soil, crack, splinter, release their contents into moving water. Unboxed remains are carried by the current, rolled through mud, tangled with debris, mingled with the bones of neighboring graves. Headstones topple, footstones vanish. The landscape itself is rewritten in a single season of high water. Picture a cemetery after such an event, not blown apart, but rearranged. Bones shifted 6 inches, or 6 feet, or 600 yards downstream. Muddy water pooling in the depressions where graves once sat. Cottonwood branches lodged against fence posts, draped with the detritus of a river that had briefly claimed everything in its reach. The sucking sound of saturated earth giving way under the weight of a footstep. You would never know, looking at the aftermath, which bones belonged where. The specific impact on Fort Sumner's cemetery was devastating precisely because it was ambiguous. No one conducted a formal survey of the damage. No one catalogued which graves were intact and which had been disturbed. The community was small, the resources non-existent, the dead already half forgotten. But some accounts, passed down through local memory, and later investigated by historians, suggest that displaced remains from the cemetery were eventually gathered and reburied in a mass grave at the Santa Fe National Cemetery, 200 miles to the north. 200 miles, that's the distance between Fort Sumner and Santa Fe. If those accounts are accurate, Billy the Kid's remains may not rest in Fort Sumner at all. He may lie in an unmarked pit in Santa Fe, mixed with the bones of soldiers and settlers and Navajo, an outlaw buried among strangers, unidentified, unremarkable. The river didn't just flood the graveyard, it edited the historical record. Markers that survived were now in wrong positions relative to the remains beneath them. The geography of the cemetery, the communal understanding of which grave was where, was scrambled beyond reliable reconstruction. The reference points were gone, the map was redrawn by water, and no human hand corrected it. But the river wasn't the only thief. While nature was rearranging the dead, humans were stealing the evidence. The headstone, that stone reading "Pals," the only physical object connecting the grave to the identities of the men supposedly beneath it, has been stolen multiple times. The exact number of thefts is itself uncertain, which tells you everything about the state of the record. The first theft occurred at an unknown date, and the stone was eventually recovered. Then it vanished again. Imagine visiting a grave and finding it simply gone. Not the body, the marker. The one object that says, "This is where he lies," removed by unknown hands for unknown reasons. Souvenir hunters, pranksters, profiteers, no one knows. No one was ever caught. The response was practical and deeply ironic. An iron cage was installed over the grave, metal bars bolted into concrete, enclosing the headstone and the mounds in a structure that looks, as more than one visitor has observed, exactly like a jail cell. Billy the Kid escaped from jail in life. In death, they put him in a cage. The irony is not subtle, and it is not accidental. The cage exists because the community ran out of options. They could not guard the grave around the clock. They could not trust the public. So they imprisoned the dead. The cage itself has become the primary artifact of the site, more photographed than the headstone, more discussed than the mounds. Tourists press against the bars, slip coins and bullets through the gaps, sun-heated iron in the New Mexico summer, almost too hot to touch. Oxidized pennies wedged between the bars, green against rusted metal. Bullet casings standing upright on the dirt like tiny monuments to a violence that ended 140 years ago. But each theft of the headstone did something more insidious than temporarily removing a marker. Each theft disrupted the already fragile chain of provenance. When the stone was recovered and replaced, who decided where it went? Was it placed in exactly the original position? Was the original position even known with certainty by the time of the recovery? Every theft and recovery introduced another layer of uncertainty. The headstone became a game of telephone played in stone, each iteration a little less reliable than the last. People don't visit a grave at Fort Sumner. They visit a cage, and inside the cage is a stone that's been stolen and replaced so many times that even the stone might not be where it started. And here's what makes it worse. The people who could have set the record straight were dying off. In the decades after Billy's burial, the precise location of his grave was maintained not by documents, not by surveys, not by any official record. It was maintained by oral tradition, the living memory of people who had been there, or who had spoken to people who had been there. Old-timers in Fort Sumner who'd witnessed the burial or learned the location from those who had could walk you to the spot. But they didn't agree. One said here, another said 3 feet to the left. A third said the whole row had shifted after the flood, and the real location was somewhere else entirely. This is not unusual for rural cemeteries of that era. Formal burial records were rare. Surveying a graveyard was an expense no one saw the need for. Memory was the archive, and memory was considered sufficient, because no one imagined that the location of a grave would matter to anyone 100 years later. But memory is not a filing cabinet. It is a living thing that shifts and degrades with every passing year. Details blur. Confidence remains even as accuracy declines. An old man who was 12 years old at the time of the burial remembers the grave in a certain spot. His neighbor, who was 15, remembers it differently. Neither is lying. Both believe they are right, and by the time anyone thought to ask them, there was no way to determine which memory, if either, was correct. As these witnesses died, through the early and mid-20th century, the living map of the cemetery died with them. By 1940, there was no one left alive who had seen the body lowered into the ground. The grave's location became a consensus, not a fact. The current site was settled on, and that phrase deserves emphasis. Not confirmed, not verified, not established through archaeological survey or forensic analysis. Settled on. A committee of locals and historians examined the available evidence, faded photographs, contradictory oral accounts, the landscape itself, and chose a spot it was the best guess anyone could make. And it became, by default, the truth. The grave stopped being a fact and became a belief. You can visit Billy the Kid's resting place today. You can stand over it. You can leave a coin or a bullet on the mound. But what you are really standing over is an agreement, a consensus, that this is probably where he is. Probably. The most famous outlaw grave in the American West, built on probably. Now, you might think, just dig it up. Open the grave. Use modern forensics, DNA analysis, dental records, ground-penetrating radar. Solve the mystery once and for all. And that brings us to the most maddening part of this entire story. No exhumation has ever been conducted at the site. No forensic analysis. No DNA testing. No ground-penetrating radar survey, at least none whose results have been made public. The technology exists. The question exists. The answer lies possibly 6 feet below the surface. And no one will look. The reasons are multiple, and each one compounds the others into an almost impenetrable wall of inaction. Legal obstacles come first. Who owns the remains? Who has legal standing to request an exhumation? New Mexico authorities have been consistently reluctant to authorize one tangled in questions of jurisdiction, descendant rights, and precedent. Cultural resistance comes second, and it may be the more powerful force. Fort Sumner's identity is built around that grave. The old Fort Sumner Museum sits nearby. Tourism depends on the mystique. The town's economy is woven into the legend. If you dig up the grave and find it empty, you don't just lose a body, you lose an industry. Then the conspiracy theories enter the picture and complicate everything further. Some claim Billy survived the shooting entirely and lived to old age. A man in Hamilton, Texas, calling himself Brushy Bill Roberts, claimed in the 1950s to be the kid himself petitioning the governor of New Mexico for a pardon. Others argue that Garrett staged the killing as a favor to his old friend, that the body in the darkroom was someone else, and that Billy rode out of Fort Sumner alive. If the grave is opened and found empty, every conspiracy theorist in the country claims vindication. If it contains remains, you still face the problem of identification. You would need DNA from verified descendants of Henry McCarty, and that lineage is itself disputed and difficult to establish. There have been occasional legal efforts, petitions, even political campaigns to force an exhumation. None have succeeded. The grave remains sealed. The only verified image of the kid shows a living man, that famous tintype from Fort Sumner, circa 1880, a young figure in a rumpled hat with a Winchester rifle. One photograph of the living man, 0 verified photographs of his actual resting place. The gap between those two facts is the size of the entire mystery. No exhumation, no DNA, no answers. We decoded the human genome. We can identify remains from a century-old battlefield with a fragment of bone, but we cannot, or will not, confirm that the most famous outlaw in American history is buried where we say he is. The battle for Billy the Kid's grave was over. The grave lost, But the story didn't end, because the myth was just getting started. Drive through the Pecos Valley today, heading toward Fort Sumner, and you pass through miles of nothing: alfalfa fields, scrubland, the occasional ranch gate, a sky so wide it makes you feel surveilled. Then you see the signs: a small parking area, a gravel path, and then the cage. The iron bars catch the light first, before you even register the headstone behind them. Visitors approach quietly, almost reverently, the way people approach any grave, except this one has a quality of theater about it that most graves lack. The cage dominates. The replacement headstone sits inside it, bearing its famous inscription. The three mounds are low, barely raised above the surrounding earth. A footstone marks the other end. Cottonwoods throw shifting shadows across the site. Wind moves through the branches with a sound like whispered conversation. The grave is rated 4.5 out of 5 by online reviewers. It is the most visited Old West outlaw burial site in America. People come from every state, from other countries, to stand at those iron bars and take photographs. They leave offerings, pennies, quarters, .45 caliber rounds pushed through the gaps in the cage, offerings to a man who might not be there, part memorial, part superstition, part performance. The nearby old Fort Sumner Museum, housed at the site of Pete Maxwell's home, the place where the kid drew his last breath, is open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. You can stand in the approximate location where Garrett fired his pistol, then walk a few hundred yards to the grave. The distance between death and burial is a few hundred yards. The distance between certainty and doubt is infinite. The uncertainty has spawned an entire ecosystem of competing claims, each feeding on the verification gap like organisms in a tide pool. The brushy Bill Roberts claim is the most famous, an old man in Texas insisting he was the kid, presenting a story detailed enough to be intriguing and flimsy enough to be dismissed. He was almost certainly not Billy the Kid, but the fact that the claim could not be definitively disproven, because the grave that could settle the question has never been opened, kept the story circulating for decades. Then there is the Garrett conspiracy, the theory that the sheriff killed the wrong man or no man at all, and helped his old friend escape into anonymity. The darkness of that bedroom, the same darkness that makes the shooting feel cinematic, also makes it deniable. Garrett claimed he recognized the voice, but voices in the dark are unreliable witnesses. Every one of these theories exists because of the verification gap. If the grave had been documented at burial, marked precisely, maintained against floods, protected against theft, and eventually subjected to forensic analysis, none of these stories would have oxygen. The mystery is not that Billy the Kid might be somewhere else. The mystery is that we allowed the evidence to disappear. Consider Garrett's own fate. He parlayed the killing into brief fame and a co-authored book. He sought political appointments, chased respectability, traded on the single most famous act of his life, but the killing corroded his reputation as much as it built it. In 1908, Garrett himself was shot and killed under disputed circumstances on a lonely road near Las Cruces. The man who killed the kid died much as the kid did, violently, ambiguously, and with a story no one can fully verify. The headstone thieves, too, have become part of the mythology. No one was ever identified. No one was ever prosecuted. The thefts, acts of vandalism at the time, became over the decades part of the legend itself. Whoever took that stone didn't just steal a marker. They stole a piece of the evidentiary chain. Every theft made the mystery deeper, the truth more remote. And then there is the modern pilgrim, the person who drives hours across the desert to stand at the cage and snap a photograph. We have more photographs of that cage than we have of the man inside it. Thousands of images posted to travel blogs, social media feeds, video thumbnails. One verified image of the kid. 0 verified images of his actual resting place. The cage appears everywhere. The truth appears nowhere. This is the paradox that draws people in. the transformation of a questionable grave into an unquestionable landmark. Billy the Kid's grave is not a historical site in the traditional sense. It is a belief system. You don't visit to learn a fact, you visit to participate in a myth. A grave chosen by memory, not by science, has become more powerful than any verified burial ever could be. The uncertainty is not a flaw in the experience, it is the experience. It is the reason the grave draws 500,000 visitors instead of a handful of historians. If they opened the ground tomorrow and found Billy's bones exactly where the headstone claims they are, the mystique would evaporate, the questions would stop, the conspiracy theories would wither, and Fort Sumner would become just another verified historical site. Interesting, but inert. The grave is famous because it might be wrong. Still no DNA, still no proof, still no exhumation, and increasingly it doesn't matter, not to the visitors, not to the town, not to the legend. The grave has become its own truth, a place where people go to honor a man who may or may not be beneath their feet, and who may or may not have been the man the dime novels described. Billy the Kid's bones may lie in Fort Sumner. They may lie in a mass grave in Santa Fe, mixed with soldiers and strangers. They may rest in Hamilton, Texas. They may have washed down the Pecos a century ago and come to rest in a sandbar miles from anywhere. We don't know. And America, a nation built on the mythology of its frontier, seems content not to know. 500,000 visitors, thousands of photographs, coins and bullets piled on the dirt. And beneath it all, maybe Billy the Kid, maybe not. The grave that everyone visits and no one can verify. That is the final joke of the American frontier. Even the dead can't be trusted to stay where you put them. If this story made you think twice about what we really know about history, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this. Legends built on shaky ground, myths that crumble when you look too close.